Ellie Reynolds was only 7, but the silence she carried made her seem older, like someone who had seen too much, too soon. She didn't speak to teachers, not to doctors, not to her therapist. She barely even spoke to her foster mother, Lisa, except for an occasional nod or shake of the head. But there was one exception to Ellie's silence: Max. Max was a retired German Shepherd K9, once the pride of the county sheriff's department. After his handler, Officer Ben Morales, was killed in the line of duty, Max had been put up for adoption. He was 5 then, too old, some said, and too trained to be a family dog. But Lisa had read his file and made the call anyway. She was already fostering Ellie, who had been placed with her just 3 months earlier after a tragic incident nobody wanted to talk about in court filings. Lisa thought maybe, just maybe, 2 broken souls could find comfort in each other. She was right. The first time Max met Ellie, he didn't bark, didn't sniff, didn't move toward her like he did with most strangers. Instead, he just sat and looked at her, his head slightly tilted. Ellie, wary and wide-eyed, walked slowly to him and placed a hand on his head. Max didn't move, but his eyes closed. Like a sigh of relief, it was as if they had both been waiting for each other. From that day on, Ellie and Max became a matched pair. She wouldn't go to school unless Max walked her to the car. At night, when the nightmares came, dark, shaking, breathless nights, she'd tap her fingers softly, and Max would hop up and curl around her like a warm, living shield. No words were needed between them. Something deeper passed in the space between girl and dog. Lisa noticed it first. Ellie wouldn't answer questions, even simple ones. But if Max was in the room, she'd tilt her head, tap her fingers, or make the faintest clicking sound with her tongue, and Max would respond. He would sit when she clicked, lay down when she tapped twice. Once, she tilted her hand to the side, and Max walked to the door. Lisa didn't understand the full code, but there was no denying it. Ellie had created a language one only Max understood. The therapist, Dr. Karen Myers, was intrigued and concerned. "This level of connection is extraordinary," she told Lisa. "But it's also likely the only outlet Ellie feels safe using. That tells us how deep her trauma runs." Lisa nodded. "She's safe now, but we both know she wasn't before." What Ellie had experienced in her biological father's care was documented only in vague, redacted reports. Terms like possible abuse, unsupervised contact, and emergency removal dotted her file. The man had been arrested, later released on a plea deal for unrelated charges. Now, somehow, unbelievably, he was trying to regain custody, and the court wanted Ellie to testify. But how could a child who hadn't spoken in months take the stand? Lisa tried to prepare her. Dr. Myers brought in courtroom dolls and role-played testimonies. Nothing worked. Ellie would clam up, rocking slightly, eyes down, until Max appeared again. Then she'd relax, whisper, tap, click. It was Dr. Myers who finally brought up the impossible idea. Let her testify with Max. He's not just a support animal, he's her interpreter. Lisa blinked. They'll never allow it. But they had no better option. The child advocate filed a motion. A judge, skeptical but curious, agreed to review Max's K9 records and Ellie's trauma history. A week later, the motion was granted. On the morning of the hearing, Lisa dressed Ellie in a clean white dress with soft blue trim, her favorite. She tied her hair back and clipped a small locket onto her collar. Inside it was a photo of Max, taken the week he arrived. As they approached the courthouse, Ellie held tightly to Max's leash. Her steps were small, hesitant, but she never looked back. Max walked beside her, head high, eyes sharp, every step as steady as a soldier on duty. Ellie was ready to speak, just not in the way anyone expected. The courtroom was colder than Ellie expected, not just in temperature but in atmosphere. Everything echoed. The scrape of shoes, the clearing of throats, the whisper of legal pads turning. Ellie gripped Max's leash tightly. He didn't tug or lead. He simply matched her pace like he had 100 times before. She stepped in, small against the imposing walls, and felt the eyes. Everyone was watching her, but she didn't look up, not even when she passed the man sitting behind the defense table, her biological father. He hadn't changed much, still broad-shouldered, still with that same tight-lipped expression that always made her chest lock up. But there was something else in his face now, confidence. He believed he'd win. Judge Hargrave glanced over his glasses as Ellie took her seat beside her advocate. "You understand why you're here today, Miss Reynolds?" Ellie said nothing. The prosecutor stood, calm and respectful. "Your Honor, we're requesting alternative testimony methods." Given the witness's trauma history and her documented selective mutism, we've submitted over 400 pages of psychiatric evaluations, behavioral reports, and support letters. Additionally, this is Max, a former canine officer trained by the department, now certified as Ellie's therapy dog. Therapy dog, the defense scoffed. This isn't a petting zoo. The judge raised a hand. Let's allow the demonstration before making objections, counselor. Dr. Myers stepped forward. Your Honor, Ellie communicates through nonverbal cues. Specifically, she's adapted Max's tactical commands from his time as a canine unit into a code of her own. It is consistent, intentional, and has been reviewed by two trauma specialists and a canine behaviorist. The defense lawyer leaned back, unimpressed. So the dog's going to testify now? Not exactly, the advocate replied, but he responds to Ellie's cues, and those responses form a pattern we believe reflect her memory of events. The judge turned to Ellie. You may proceed. Ellie sat still for a moment. Then she reached down and lightly tapped her fingers against Max's back. He sat up straighter. A second later, she made a quiet clicking sound with her tongue. Max barked. Once short, alert, gasps whispered across the courtroom. The judge's brow lifted. And what does that signify? Dr. Myers stepped in. That sequence means danger. She uses it whenever referencing trauma. In this context, she's responding to being asked why she's here. She believes she's in danger. The defense stood. Your Honor, this is speculative. It's a trick, no trick. Dr. Myers replied evenly. We've repeated this with dozens of prompts. The signals are consistent. Ellie gently leaned forward, whispered something only Max could hear. He growled low, not aggressive, but protective. His body stiffened, positioning himself between Ellie and the defense table. Lisa, watching from the gallery, held her breath. Max's posture was unmistakable, guarding. Judge Hargrave tilted his head. That's a classic canine signal, correct? The dog's shielding. Yes, sir, said the trainer sitting in the front row. Max was trained to guard survivors of violent incidents. That reaction is precise and deliberate. Ellie's father shifted uneasily. The judge nodded slowly. Let the record show that Max responded to the child's whisper by assuming a defensive stance. Ellie didn't blink. Her fingers stayed curled in Max's fur, her eyes fixed downward. But her body stopped trembling. She wasn't alone up there. She had a voice, a language, a protector. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Continue your questions, but slowly. Let the girl proceed at her own pace, Ellie, the woman said, gently. Can you tell us what you remember about the night you were taken from your home? Ellie leaned closer to Max, barely moving her lips. Another whisper. Max turned to face the judge's bench. Then he sat, barked twice, and lay down. The courtroom fell silent again. The trainer broke it softly. To barks and a lay down, that means yes. I was afraid, and it happened at night. It's one of her consistent sequences. Even the judge looked stunned. From across the courtroom, Ellie's father's smirk was gone. His face had changed, and the silence, for the first time, spoke more than words ever could. The courtroom sat on edge, straddling the line between skepticism and awe. No one had seen anything like it. A little girl directing a highly trained canine, not with voice or command, but with soft, barely audible whispers and subtle cues only the dog could interpret. Yet every movement Max made seemed intentional, precise. This wasn't random behavior. This was testimony in its own extraordinary form. The judge motioned for the next question. The prosecutor leaned forward gently. Ellie, can you show us, using Max, where you were in the house that night? Ellie hesitated. Then she brushed the back of her hand along Max's neck twice, then pressed her palm to his head. Max stood up and turned to face her left, toward the prosecution bench. He took 2 steps forward, stopped, barked once, and sat. That means her bedroom, the trainer whispered. We've seen her do this in therapy. It's how she recreates scenes. The judge scribbled notes with sharp strokes, eyes following Max's every move. Ellie whispered again, so faintly even the sensitive microphone picked up only air. Max walked 3 steps forward, turned right, and sat again. She's mapping the hallway, the therapist explained. The prosecutor dared ask the next question. Did someone come into your room that night? Ellie didn't answer aloud. Of course. Instead, she leaned her cheek against Max's head, then tapped twice on his ribs. Max growled low. His body stiffened again. The court gasped. The judge leaned forward. What does that mean? It's the command Ellie gives when referencing a threat, said the trainer. She's indicating someone came into her room. Max's growl is confirmation. She uses that response to convey fear or danger from someone approaching her. Ellie's father crossed his arms tightly, visibly uncomfortable for the first time. The defense lawyer jumped up. Objection. This is highly theatrical. We're allowing a dog to replace a sworn statement. Judge Hargrave didn't blink. Sit down, counselor. The evidence here is more coherent than half the testimony I've seen from adults. Ellie shifted in her chair, turning her face slightly away from the man across the courtroom. Her eyes drifted to a high corner of the room where no one stood. Then she clicked her tongue once and made a soft sound. Max responded by lying down completely, his head low, ears alert. What did she just say? The judge asked. She was hiding. Dr. Myers replied. That's the command Max learned when someone was escaping a situation or waiting for backup. She's reliving the moment she hid from her father. Suddenly, Ellie's father slammed his hand on the table. This is garbage. I never. Max was on his feet in a second, barking sharply, his body directly in front of Ellie. A wall of muscle and intent. Two security officers moved in. The judge's gavel slammed down. Enough. Judge Hargrave's voice cracked like a whip. You will not intimidate this child or this court. Her father sat down, face red, breath labored. Lisa, seated in the gallery, clutched her hands over her heart. She had always known something terrible had happened, but she'd never had a way to prove it. Now, Ellie was proving it, not with testimony anyone expected, but with the one tool she trusted, Max. The courtroom grew silent again. Judge Hargrave exhaled. Let the record reflect that the child's emotional distress and the dog's trained, protective behavior are being taken into full account. I want Max's full canine service file on my desk by morning. He looked at Ellie not like she was a broken child, but like she was someone impossibly brave. And then, quietly, he said something no one expected. You've been heard. Asterisk plus. The courtroom recessed for lunch, but no one left with an appetite. The air still vibrated from Max's last bark, and the judge's closing words, you've been heard, echoed more powerfully than any gavel. Ellie remained still in her chair, one hand resting gently on Max's neck. She wasn't trembling anymore. In Judge Hargrave's chambers, tension stirred between duty and disbelief. He sat with Max's thick canine dossier open in front of him. Dozens of pages documented Max's service, narcotics, search and rescue, threat detection, victim shielding. His handlers had praised him as intuitive, highly adaptive, and unusually bonded with trauma survivors. But one note stood out in bold ink: has demonstrated ability to respond to non-standard verbal and non-verbal cues. When bonded with a specific handler, the judge folded his hands beneath his chin. She rewired his training, he muttered, turned a combat dog into a translator. Meanwhile, back in the hallway, Lisa crouched next to Ellie, brushing a lock of hair behind the girl's ear. You're doing amazing, she whispered. You don't have to do anything else unless you want to. You understand? Ellie didn't speak. She nodded once, then leaned her forehead against Max's head. It was his way of telling her she was safe, and it was her way of saying she wanted to finish what she started. Inside the courtroom, when the session resumed, the judge made a rare move. I would like Dr. Myers and Max's original canine trainer to join us at the bench. Their testimonies will help the court understand what we're seeing. Both professionals were sworn in. The trainer, Sergeant Blake Harlan, spoke first. Your Honor, Max was one of our most elite working dogs. His training involved tactical signals, hand gestures, and advanced threat responses. But after Officer Morales died, Max was inconsolable. We tried to retire him. 3 times he wouldn't bond with anyone, until Ellie. And in your professional opinion, the judge asked, has she modified or created her own code from that training? Harlan nodded. Absolutely. She's repurposed dozens of his original commands into a unique language, one that seems to reflect her experiences. It's structured, repeatable, more reliable than a child's spoken memory under trauma. Dr. Myers added, in psychology, we often look for alternative communication in traumatized children: art, play, music. Ellie's is Max. Her trust was shattered by human contact. But Max has never let her down. The defense attorney scoffed. This is hearsay through a dog. Judge Hargrave turned sharply. This is a trauma survivor finding a way to testify in the only language she feels safe using, and the court will hear her. He nodded to the prosecutor. I'd like to enter into evidence Exhibit D, the attorney said, holding up a series of diagrams. These are behavioral maps of Ellie's commands and Max's reactions, documented over 16 therapy sessions. She's used the same exact sequence to describe the night in question in all 16. The judge examined the pages. A sharp breath escaped his lips. That level of consistency, that's not chance. Then he looked back at Ellie, whose small hand was again tracing circles in Max's fur. Ms. Reynolds, I need to ask one more question. You don't have to answer, but if you choose to, you can answer your way. Ellie glanced up for just a second. Then she leaned down, whispered one word inaudible to anyone but Max. The dog stood, turned sharply to face her father, growled again, and barked 3 times slowly. Then he sat. The courtroom froze. Sergeant Harlan's voice was thick with emotion. 3 barks in that tone means yes, confirmed and witnessed. That's her way of saying he did it, and she remembers it clearly. Her father didn't move. The judge closed the file and straightened in his seat. This court has just heard a child speak the unspeakable, not with words, but with truth. And it is more compelling than most testimonies we hear on this bench. For the first time, Ellie blinked back tears not of fear, but of release. Ellie's whisper still hung in the air, though no one had heard it except Max. The retired canine's ears had perked, his tail stiffened, and then he'd barked exactly 3 times, with a deliberate pause between each one. It was methodical, almost rehearsed. The judge sat back in his chair, his face unreadable but his eyes focused like lasers. The whole room felt like it was holding its breath. 3 barks. Sergeant Harlan repeated from the witness stand. That's Ellie's confirmation code. It's her way of identifying what happened and who did it. Max didn't growl this time. He didn't need to. His job was done. He had spoken, in the only way Ellie had taught him. Across the courtroom, Ellie's biological father sat like stone. His arms were crossed tight, jaw clenching, muscles twitching under his pressed shirt. Something in him was unraveling and everyone in the room could see it. His face had gone pale. The prosecutor moved closer to the bench. Your Honor, we request the court accept Max's responses when backed by documented behavioral analysis and certified expert testimony as corroborative evidence under trauma-informed protocol. The defense attorney jumped to his feet. This is absurd. We're taking barking as a deposition now? What's next, fortune-telling parrots? Sit down, counselor, Judge Hargrave said, not even looking at him. You're mocking a child's only method of communicating after trauma. I won't allow it. That's when Ellie's father made his fatal mistake. He slammed his hand against the defense table, his voice rising, sharp and trembling with anger. This is all fake. A stunt. She's been coached. That dog's just reacting to treats or signals you planted. The courtroom went dead quiet. Ellie didn't flinch, but Max stood. It wasn't a reactive bark or defensive lunge. It was trained instinct. The moment Ellie's stress peaked, Max's protective protocol kicked in. His muscles tensed, his gaze locked on the man across the room, and he stepped forward until his body completely blocked Ellie from view. One paw in front of the other, slow, deliberate, a silent warning. Lisa gasped quietly from the gallery. The child advocate reached out but didn't interfere. This was Max's space now. Control your client. The judge snapped, but it was too late. Ellie's father rose again, pointing a trembling finger at Max. This animal is being used to lie about me. Max let out a deep, guttural growl that made even the bailiff stiffen. 2 court officers stepped forward instantly, placing themselves between Max and the man. One placed a hand on his holstered taser, not out of fear of the dog, but to de-escalate what was spiraling out of control. I want him removed, the father shouted. That mutt doesn't belong in here. Enough, Judge Hargrave thundered, slamming his gavel so hard it echoed off the walls. One more word, and I'll have you removed. Ellie's hand, still resting on Max's fur, hadn't moved, but her eyes were wide, locked on her father for the first time in the entire trial, not hiding, not curling inward, just watching. Seeing. The judge took a breath, then spoke directly to Ellie for the first time since the outburst. Ms. Reynolds, would you like to continue? Or would you prefer we stop here? Ellie didn't nod, didn't blink. She simply reached up, touched the top of Max's head, and tapped her fingers once, twice. Max laid down slowly, his body still between her and her father, his head resting on his paws. Alert but calm, Sergeant Harlan spoke again. That's her way of saying she's okay, that she's ready to continue. The judge sat back and looked over the courtroom like a man carrying the weight of a nation. In 30 years on this bench, he said quietly, I've never seen testimony this brave. Ellie had not said a single audible word, but her voice through Max was now impossible to ignore. The courtroom had settled into a tense quiet again, but something had shifted. The defense was no longer sneering. The smirk Ellie's father wore at the beginning of the hearing had vanished completely. He now sat still, jaw clenched, breathing shallow, his confident posture slowly folding in on itself. Max remained stretched across the floor, ears up, still positioned between Ellie and her father, calm but ready. The judge broke the silence. Defense may proceed with cross-examination, but let me be clear. If your client raises his voice again or shows any further aggression, I will have him removed permanently. The defense attorney stood slowly, his earlier bravado drained. He approached the child advocate with caution, as though the air itself had grown heavier. Ms. Reynolds, he began, directing his words more to the room than to Ellie. How do we know these responses from the dog aren't just tricks? That he isn't simply reacting to your movements without understanding any true meaning? Ellie didn't look at him. She ran her fingers gently over Max's side in 3 short strokes. Max barked once. Sergeant Harlan stood from the gallery. That's a no, a clear refutation. She's answered your question, counselor. The defense attorney turned to the judge. Your Honor, this is unprecedented. We're allowing an animal to answer cross-examination questions. There's no legal structure for this. The judge didn't hesitate. There's also no legal structure that prohibits a trauma survivor from using a translator. And in this case, that translator happens to have 4 legs. Frustrated, the defense lawyer changed tack. Your father says he never hurt you, that you were confused, scared of the dark, isn't that right? Ellie whispered something into Max's ear. The dog didn't bark. Instead, he stood and walked 3 paces to the left, then turned, faced her father, and barked once before lying down and letting out a low, warning growl. The courtroom held its breath. Sergeant Harlan spoke. Again, that's the movement pattern for someone entered, followed by identification and a warning. She's confirming it was him. Ellie's father shot to his feet. She's a liar. She was a messed up little girl who made up stories, always trying to get attention. Max erupted. He surged up with a bark so deep and sharp it rattled the walls. Before anyone could move, the court officers had restrained the man, forcing him back into his seat. But the damage was done. His mask had slipped. The charm, the composure, it all dissolved under pressure. His rage, real and unfiltered, had exposed itself for everyone to see. Lisa watched from the gallery, clutching her coat over her chest, her heart pounding. She had waited months, years to see someone finally believe Ellie. Now the truth was uncoiling itself like a long-buried cable, raw, undeniable. The judge turned to the officers. Remove him. 2 deputies approached and lifted Ellie's father from his seat. He cursed, struggled briefly, then gave up. His shoulders sagged as he was led out of the courtroom. Max relaxed instantly. His ears softened. He returned to Ellie's side and sat beside her, tail brushing the floor slowly, reassuringly. She leaned into him, visibly calmer. The judge paused for a long moment, then turned to the court reporter. Let the record reflect that the defendant's outburst, in direct response to the child's nonverbal communication, has resulted in his removal from the courtroom. He looked directly at the defense. You may file any motions you like, but if you ask me whether this child has spoken the truth today, my answer is yes. Ellie, still silent, tapped Max once. The dog responded by resting his head gently on her lap. For the first time since the hearing began, Ellie's lips curved into a small, tired smile. She didn't need words. She never did. Max had been her voice and the courtroom had finally listened. The following morning, the courtroom was unusually still. No bustling media, no side chatter between attorneys. Everyone knew what was coming. Ellie sat quietly in her seat, Max beside her. As always, this time, he was calm, not alert, not defensive, but at peace. He sensed it was over. Ellie did too. Judge Hargrave entered the courtroom with a firm stride, a man who had spent the night not just reviewing documents, but wrestling with precedent. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and looked out across the courtroom, not at the lawyers, but at the child and her dog. This case, he began, has challenged every conventional notion of how testimony is received, how trauma is communicated, and how truth is validated in a court of law. Ellie didn't move. She kept her hand resting gently on Max's side. I have reviewed Max's canine records, the child's psychological evaluations, the footage of each court session, and the statements from certified experts. What has occurred in this courtroom may be unusual, but it is not fiction. He looked at Ellie again. The court recognizes your courage and your method of communication. Max thumped his tail once on the floor, sensing the emotional shift in the room. The judge continued. This child has shown us through behavior, through pattern, and through the loyalty of a protector that her experience is not to be dismissed. This is not anecdotal, it is credible, and it is consistent with every trauma indicator known in the psychological field. He paused and turned to the prosecutor. Your motion for permanent revocation of parental rights is granted. The gallery let out a collective exhale. Lisa covered her mouth, eyes brimming with tears. Furthermore, the judge added, guardianship of the minor child, Ellie Reynolds, is hereby permanently awarded to Ms. Lisa Bennett. The court finds her to be a fit, loving guardian who has shown unmatched support through this child's healing. Lisa couldn't stop the tears now. Ellie looked over at her, her expression softening. For a long time, that had been the only thing Lisa wanted, to see something in Ellie's face that looked like relief. Now it was there. The judge leaned forward one final time. Let the record reflect that this court accepts alternative communication methods in the context of trauma-informed proceedings, and let this serve as precedent for future children who may not use their voices but still speak volumes. The defense attorney quietly gathered his papers, defeated. He didn't even make eye contact with the bench. As he turned to leave, the child advocate whispered to him, "You underestimated her." Max stood slowly, then walked to the center of the courtroom, sat, and looked directly at the judge. Judge Hargrave smiled faintly and nodded to the dog. Good boy. It was not just a gesture, it was a declaration. Ellie reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the small silver locket Lisa had given her the day before the trial began. She opened it and looked at the photo inside her and Max. Noses touching, she leaned down, whispered something into his fur. No one heard the words. They weren't meant for anyone else. Max wagged his tail once, gently. The bailiff motioned for everyone to rise. Court was adjourned. As they exited the courtroom, reporters tried to approach, but the child advocate waved them away. No comment, she said. But no, this justice listened. For once, it truly listened outside the courthouse. Lisa knelt beside Ellie and pulled her into a hug. Max leaned into them, wrapping the small family in warmth and safety. You're safe now, baby, Lisa whispered. Ellie didn't respond. She didn't need to. She wrapped her arms around Max and held on, her eyes blinking toward the sun. This wasn't just the end of a trial. It was the beginning of a new life. The sun outside the courthouse painted everything in soft gold, as if the sky itself understood what had just happened inside. Ellie stood quietly on the steps, her small fingers curled into Max's fur. He stood beside her like a sentinel, eyes scanning the crowd but body calm. For the first time in months, Ellie wasn't hiding behind him, she was standing beside him. Lisa reached down, brushing a strand of hair from Ellie's face. You did something incredible in there, she said softly. You were brave. Ellie didn't answer, but her hand gently patted Max's back in a familiar rhythm. He responded by resting his head against her side, exhaling a deep breath, as if he too was letting go of everything he'd carried. Reporters stood at a distance, held back by a court order and the respectful presence of the child advocate. Flashbulbs were ready, cameras focused, but no one dared approach. What had happened in that courtroom wasn't just a legal win, it was a cultural shockwave. Trauma had spoken through paw prints and protective barks, and the world had listened. Behind them, the doors to the courthouse opened again. Judge Hargrave stepped out, still in his robes, surprising everyone. He walked past the reporters without a glance, headed directly for Ellie and Max. Lisa straightened nervously, unsure of what to expect. The judge crouched down to Max's level, eye to eye with the dog who had changed everything. You did your duty, he said quietly, his voice low and reverent. You protected her. You translated her pain into something the world could understand. Max blinked slowly and let out a soft, gruff sound, almost a sigh. The judge then looked up at Ellie. Young lady, you taught us something no law book ever could. Ellie tilted her head, listening. You reminded us that truth doesn't always come in a sentence. Sometimes it comes in a signal, a whisper, a look. And if we're wise enough to stop and listen, even silence can speak justice. Ellie didn't smile. Not exactly, but her eyes softened, and she nodded. The judge stood and turned to Lisa. Protect them both, he said simply. They're rare. Lisa swallowed hard and nodded. I will, I promise. After he left, the crowd began to disperse. Lisa guided Ellie and Max toward the parking lot, where the car waited. But before they climbed in, Ellie did something she hadn't done in nearly a year. She let go of Max's leash for a brief moment. She walked ahead without him, her tiny frame casting a long shadow in the light. Max followed, of course, but the leash remained loose in Lisa's hand. It was a small act, but monumental. Ellie had always needed Max between her and the world, but now she was starting to believe she might not have to hide anymore. Later that evening, back at home, Lisa poured hot cocoa into 2 mugs, one with a cartoon puppy for Ellie, and one plain white. Max had a bowl of his favorite chicken-flavored kibble beside the fireplace. Ellie curled up on the couch, Max beside her, his head in her lap. Lisa sat on the other side and handed her the locket again. "This is yours now," she said. Ellie opened it, staring at the photo. Then, in a whisper so faint Lisa barely heard it, she said, "He saved me." Lisa froze. It was the first time she had heard Ellie speak a full sentence. Tears welled up, but she held them back. She just smiled and replied, "He saved us both." Max wagged his tail, eyes half closed, resting peacefully. The whisper was real, the verdict was final, and Ella silent. No more was finally free.